Will it be remembered as France's reckoning with sexual violence in the digital age? Closing arguments in the mass rape trial of 51 men invited over the internet into the home of Dominique Pelicot to rape his sedated wife, Gisèle. And this over a period of years. Defendants of all ages, all backgrounds, a few who confess, many who insist they're not rapists and thought it was all part of a sex game. The French government's now considering whether to introduce the notion of consent into French law. Is a bill needed after 2 months of testimony in a trial that's caught the world's eye? Is the public more aware of the concept of toxic masculinity and how it's propagated in today's world? There's growing awareness, but also a growing backlash, with Donald Trump and his boasts about being a man's man making a return to traditional gender roles, a winning campaign issue in the recent U.S. elections. How to break through echo chambers on this one? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about France's reckoning with rape, and joining us, attorney and activist Rachel Fleur-Pardo. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
With us as well, Alexandra Lachowski, board member of the support group Women for Women France. Welcome.
Thank you.
Elsa Labouret is spokesperson for the Oser le Féminisme platform, which, how does it translate?
It's hard to translate. Dare to be feminist.
Dare to be feminist. There you go. And from London, Cécile Simons, researcher at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
A reminder, you can always listen, like, and subscribe to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. It's a scene that's played out every day at the Avignon courthouse since September the 2nd and the opening of the Mazan trial, named for the small village in southern France, where the crime was repeated so often over so many years. Gisèle Pelicot cheered by admirers, the victim opting to go public and sit front and center every day in a case that centers around her ex-husband. Gisèle Pelicot, for years, tried with doctors to figure out why she was suffering from terrible headaches and drowsiness. In closing arguments Monday, the state asked for a 20-year sentence for her ex-husband, varying jail terms for the other 50 participants. Karis Garland was there at the courthouse in Avignon to report on the defense's rebuttal.
Acknowledging that she's become known as the lawyer for the devil, Béatrice Zavarro is under no illusion, but she still sought to humanize Dominique Pelicot in her closing arguments at the courthouse here in Avignon, and perhaps in a bid to explain how we got here. Zavarro sought to remind the court of Pelicot's trauma, saying that he witnessed the rape of his mother by his father at a young age, that he himself was raped by a nurse, and that in his teenage years, he was forced to participate in a gang rape. Well, then she also sought to remind the court of the romance that once existed between Dominique and his ex-wife Gisèle, saying that it was love at first sight, and turning to Gisèle in the court, saying that she believed that this love was true. Well, she finished these closing arguments noting the regret that her client felt, that his family was the most beautiful thing that he ever had, and that now that's ruined, that he regrets the fact that his children probably won't ever come to mourn him at his grave. And then she finished reading a poem that Dominique Pelicot had written for Gisèle in court. So these closing arguments of the defense lawyers are set to continue on Thursday and then run until December 13.
Until December 13th. Rachel Fleur-Pardo, your thoughts on what we've heard during these closing statements?
Basically, it's different lawyers doing their job. I want to maybe refer to Dominique Pelicot's lawyer, who has been doing a very difficult and I think a very difficult job, and with a great talent, and I think that she has honored the lawyer profession. I also want to refer to what we saw earlier with all these persons cheering Gisèle Pelicot as she was coming into the courtroom.
Which is twice a day, because there's a break for lunch.
Absolutely. This is totally unusual. And Gisèle Pelicot in this trial has sent this message to victims of rape. The message that it is sending, it is that it is not for victims or plaintiffs to have shame, but for defendants and accused persons to be ashamed of the rape trial they are in.
So what do you think? Because the cover of that newspaper we showed, that regional newspaper, it's about the sentence required for the husband, but the picture is of the wife.
Oh, yeah, I did not notice that actually, but yeah, absolutely. And also, I think everyone will remember Gisèle Pelicot. Gisèle, also, it's thanks to her courage of making this case a public trial. She had the choice to keep it private, and she decided to sacrifice a bit of her privacy for the world to see what is the reality of sexual violence, what is the reality of rape, and how the French justice system deals with that. And to her, for that, I just want to say a very big thank you.
All right, so 20 years is what's required for her ex-husband. In the last days, feminist groups have hung a banner across the street calling for all of the defendants to receive 20-year sentences. For the defense lawyers, a blanket maximum term for everyone would be vengeance, not justice.
We started from a very high baseline, namely 10 years, and I would remind you that one of my clients, who was the subject of a request for 10 years, did not in any way physically penetrate Mrs. Pelicot, and as a result did nothing. Nevertheless, the sentence requested is very high, which implies that others will receive similar sentences. For instance, consider another client of mine who is facing a request for 17 years in prison, just 3 years less than Dominique Pelicot, despite only being involved in a few minutes of Mrs. Pelicot's life.
Alexandra Lachowski, a mass trial like this, is this the right way to go? And this call for a blanket 20-year sentence, do you agree with that?
I have to say that I'm quite happy with the indictments that were made. They go from 4 to 20 years. 4 years is for one of the defendants who was indicted for sexual assault. These are significant in the sense that the average indictments are 11.1 years in rape cases. And one thing that I think indictments. Mm-hmm. So one thing that I'm very satisfied with is the way that the senior prosecutors have actually presented the indictments. Because what they have said and what they have done is setting the record straight. What they've said is, we're giving Dominique Pelicot the highest sentence possible under the current law. There is not even the semblance of a doubt that Gisèle Pelicot had not consented to these crimes. There is not a semblance of a doubt that these defendants had the intention of raping Gisèle Pelicot, and this is a very, very clear message that rape is a heinous crime, and it is prosecuted, and it can be prosecuted as a very serious crime.
And when that defense attorney says, hey, my client saw her once, and they're asking for 17 years, which is 3 less than Dominique Pelicot, what do you respond to that?
So if that's the one, the case that, the defendant that you're referring to is the one that reproduced those methods against his own wife. So what he has done is actually done exactly the same as Dominique Pelicot, had orchestrated rapes and sedated his wife. And I think that there were approximately maybe 12 occurrences of rape against his own wife.
It's been a long trial, 12 weeks, and that's, of course, in part because there are so many defendants in the box. Newspaper Le Monde listing all of them, including one 43-year-old of Turkish origin who testified Gisèle Pelicot seemed inanimate, but he thought it was part of a sex game. He said, I don't accept being branded a rapist. It's too heavy to bear. And that there are varying reactions. Elsa Labouret, your reaction to that?
Well, I don't feel sorry for that man. I think the key thing is most rapists don't like to think of themselves as rapists. And I think that's one of the key things about rape today in our society and in most societies, is that the word is starting to scare people, but the fact isn't scaring people yet. So I think people
It's not scaring people yet.
Not enough. This man is saying, I don't want to be called a rapist. But what he did, allegedly, what he was accused of doing, is rape in regard to the law. So he can decide not to call himself that, but he might still be. And I think, there were studies that show that when, you ask men, have you ever raped someone? They will say, no, I have never raped someone. But when you ask them, have you ever disregarded consent? Have you ever insisted until the person said yes? Have you ever, made sure the woman drank a little bit more alcohol, et cetera, all these strategies? Most of them will change their answer. So a lot of men are in fact, rapists, or they try to be, or they engage in these behaviors, but they don't want to call themselves that. And it's the same thing when they say, I didn't come there in intent to rape this person, but you did allegedly. So that's not the point.
He says he was tricked, that he thought it was all part of some sex game.
Yeah, a lot of them say that. And that's, I'm not a lawyer, but, you're trying to defend yourself against such an accusation. You're going to try to give arguments, to diminish what you're accused of doing. So I understand why they say that, but it doesn't hold up. Because, in any case of doubt, you should just go home. And some men did, most of them didn't. And even the ones who didn't call the police, but that's another matter. There is no gray area in regards to, is it sex or is it rape? It's one or the other. And if you don't know, don't do anything, just go home.
None of them called the police. Cécile Simmons, is this, I guess this is one of the reasons why this case has drawn so much attention all over the world, really. What's been the reaction where you are?
Oh, I think obviously the case has really shocked the world, really, and the reactions have been, I think, obviously similar to France in the UK. But I think that what we're certainly feeling here is that this is a turning point in kind of discussions about Me Too. There has been certainly the perception that obviously the backlash to Me Too was swift in the English-speaking world, but that in France, it was particularly strong, and that for a long time, as we saw accusations against powerful men, powerful political figures as well, came out in support of these men, calling them manhunts. And I think that there is a sense that the conversation is finally shifting.
Finally shifting, because there was this kind of positivist view of how eventually there was no turning back, that enough was enough, was no longer going to be supported. There wasn't going to be this kind of sexism, and sexual violence was no longer going to be supported in the same way. But when you look at the specifics of this case, how the internet made it all possible, are you as hopeful as all that?
I think I'm actually not that hopeful because the internet and the online world is really an area where sexual violence and violence against women has been able to thrive online. And when we think of a case like the Pelicot case, actually it is part of a much broader spectrum of behaviors. And what's particularly worrying to me is that we have seen an anti-feminist backlash and sort of male supremacist ideology spread online in the last few years. We've seen it through the rise of misogynistic influencers who are telling young men that they have a right to women's bodies, that they should coerce women. We have seen this through the rise of hideous abuse campaigns. 10 years after Gamergate, in every election, there are abuse campaigns against women, sexual harassment. We're seeing this through the epidemic of non-consensual deepfakes, explicit deepfakes. And so actually, what we're seeing is that there are multiple sort of violations and acts of violence against women online, and that social media platforms have enabled that. And it has also given, I suppose, a space for abusers to circumvent any policies and find new ways to, commit crimes, which is very concerning. Yeah,
we noted in this very studio, on this very show, during the U.S. election campaign, that there was sort of a growing gender gap in voting intentions between those who supported Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Already back in February, a King's College London survey showed more negative reactions to feminism among teenage boys and young men than older baby boomers. The report sounded the alarm of, quote, a real risk of fractious division among this coming generation. Is there, in this country, Elsa Labouré, the sense of a war of the sexes that's brewing, and that the people around this table look at the Mazan trial one way, but that's not all of the French?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have, my finger on the pulse of the entire generation that is on the internet right now, but it's not, I would agree with Ms. Simmons that I'm not optimistic either, because I don't think it's that quick. We had a lot of hope on the Me Too movement, but it didn't change that much. And we shouldn't hang up too much hope on this trial. I think it participates in conversations, and it's really important. It's a big thing that's happening, but change takes time. And also, every time there's a change in the right direction, there's backlash as well. That happens in every social struggle. It happens every time. And this is what we see, particularly not for the Gisèle trial, but just for, every time you feel like, women's rights are advancing, there is, anti-feminist movement, anti-feminist, state of mind that is also progressing. And I think young men are particularly susceptible to that. They feel particularly vulnerable because they feel like feminism is infringing on their rights. And
do you think the next time there'll be a presidential election here in France, which is scheduled for 2027 right now, that there will be this call to have men be men and this kind of thing?
I wouldn't say it's. I don't know how connected it is. How connected voter behavior is to that. I think it's more of a cultural sort of mindset or climate. Because we also see feminism being weaponized by the far right in France. We see that a lot, particularly for racist agendas. So I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, and it's not just in voter behavior that we can see that. But for example, this case has brought up a lot of hashtag not all men sort of sentiment. We see a lot of that. We saw a lot of that with this trial. A lot of men were preoccupied not with showing empathy to Gisèle Pelicot and trying to be more deserving of trust for their female friends and family members who maybe have gone through horrible things. They didn't, choose to look at their own behaviors and ask themselves, am I participating in this climate that makes women so unsafe, that makes men so, bold as to do something like that what happened to Gisèle Pelicot. They were more preoccupied with trying to save their image and convince themselves and the people around them that they're safe, they're the good people, they're the good guys. And that's unfortunately showing that we're not necessarily moving very quickly in the right direction.
Alexandra Lachowski, your thoughts on this, and thoughts about the younger generation on.
And actually it's the case every time that we hear about sexual abuse, we have a chorus of men chanting, not all men. And it's stupid at its core, this sentence, because women really don't need to be reminded that all men are not rapists, the same way that they don't need to be reminded that all men don't have brown hair or blue eyes. That's a fact. The problem here is that any man who fails to address the systemic roots of sexual violence, of gender-based violence, and who fails to realize that they're in a system that is designed by men, for men, and that this violence is rooted and perpetuated by the system, and they don't try to deconstruct that, that's where they become part of the problem.
And so how do you broach the conversation, and are the French doing it the right way?
How do you broach the conversation? I think that one thing that the Gisèle Pelicot case has done is that it has triggered conversation. There was quite an interesting statistic from NIFOP, Institut Français de l'Opinion Publique, which mentioned that the Gisèle Pelicot case was actually the second most spoken of topic in France in the past months. So the conversation is happening. Is it happening with the enough men? That's something that I think we can agree to say that, for example, in the protests on Saturday, it was beautiful to see that there are a lot of people. It would have been beautiful to see that there were more men, and not men just accompanying their girlfriends, their friends, but groups of men who were there to support that cause. What I think that so that's an impact that it has. It's triggered the conversation. How do we broach? How do we create that bridge to continue to make people feel involved, to make men feel involved? Is that we continue and we seize this opportunity because we have the attention. We have the attention of the media. We have the attention of decision makers. We have the attention of a part of the public. We seize this opportunity to continue raising awareness and continue advocating to dismantle the system and trigger a paradigm shift.
Is it 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, or a zero-sum game, Rachel Florpardo?
No, I hope we are moving forward. I want to keep being optimistic about that, and I'm optimistic about the effect of the Mazan's trial on the French society, and I hope maybe also abroad. You were saying earlier that basically the Mazan's trial was an occasion to bring the conversation about rape and sexual violence and sexual education as well. It's indeed impressive, the huge media coverage that received this trial, both in France and abroad. And I think that this is a first win, because by speaking about what it is, we helped maybe describing a better version of what rape is. And in our collective imagination, we often picture rape as an act of violence. But the French law also sanctions rape by constraint, by threat, or by surprise. Rape is not always violent when it is sentenced by French judges. And by this whole demonstration, by speaking out loud about what it is, by showing the people the diversity of sexual violence, I hope that we helped people maybe being more aware of what it is and being able to stop a violence when they witness one. And this is obviously something that is already a gain. And also I want to speak about the drugs that were imposed to Gisèle Pelicot. Basically, you said it earlier, but she had to go to doctors for 10 years before anyone was able to explain her what happened to her. And I think that if another woman was in Gisèle Pelicot's situation today and she was going to see any kind of doctor in France, maybe that doctor will be more aware and have the thought of considering that maybe she has been drugged and give her the appropriate tests.
All right, Cécile Simmons, 2 questions on that. First off, are more of these date rape drugs being used, or is there more awareness?
I mean, actually, I think that not being a lawyer, I think I would struggle to answer that question, not having the data.
All right, I have a second question for you, which is, when it comes to, we were talking about the topic of toxic masculinity, the pushback against trying to come to terms with sexual violence. Are you sensing this generation gap between younger men and older men?
I think that what's really interesting when we talk about fixing some of the underlying structures that lead to the spectrum of harmful and violent behaviors towards women is that we really kind of need, I suppose, men to step up. What we're seeing is that young men are becoming radicalized online. They are in echo chambers and they are in online spaces when they are told that it's okay to, coerce women, that women belong to them. And I think that there is a role for older men to play, for sure. And I think that one of the key things here in addressing some of this radicalization that we're seeing is making sure that young men can connect with older men. We need to make sure that we have educational, social structures where we can have conversations about gender norms, about consent. And men have a part to play in those conversations. And sadly, I think beyond one case, what's important is beyond the big, important conversation now taking place in relation to this trial is to make sure that after that, we have something else to give to young men, that we have more investment in these educational spaces, more avenues for these conversations to take place, so that, we don't say never again, but then don't actually translate this into action and into long-term discussions.
So, Alexandra Lachowski, France, as you know, is very top-down. You know, the things come from Paris, from the government, and down. So, when it comes to, I'll employ the same words that Cécile just did, de-radicalization. Is it the state's job to be in charge of that, to oversee it all?
What I think is that the state definitely has a role to play. And actually, Rachel.
So what does that mean? Does that mean specifically, putting it on the curriculum in schools?
That's exactly where I was going because of something that Rachel said just previously. I think that what happened today is that we have given it to pornography and online content to forge and to educate men and women to sexuality. We have not institutionalized it at all. I think that very recently there is a law in France that has been enacted to impose on schools to have that in their curriculum. And so I think that is one of the most fundamental avenues to be able to start teaching our youth what is a sexual relationship, what is consent, what is bodily autonomy. And I think that the state does have a role to institutionalize that education.
Elsa Labouré?
As with a lot of things in this country, the problem isn't the law, the problem is in the application of the law. We've had a law on sexual education in schools since over 20 years, 2001, for three courses per year, which is nothing, honestly.
So what does that mean, 3 hours a year?
3 courses is what the law says. So interpretation, discretion.
So it's not even necessarily 3 hours?
It's not necessarily 3 hours, but it's not even happening. It's not happening at all. I think less than 20% of kids are actually having these classes. There's just too many actors in it. There's too many. It's just that nobody seems to care about this, and it doesn't seem to be enacted at all. This law has been there since 2001, and nothing's really happening. And exactly like you said, we've given in. Pornography has played a huge role in this case. We see it. We see because it influenced, Dominique Pelicot's mind, and he created his own pornography, which is something that is not talked about enough. He created his own pornography to watch, to pleasure himself to maybe share with other people, and he's, encouraged men to do the same. And this is how the case was, brought to light. But this is very, very unique, and it's not something that usually happens in these cases. But also because we don't think about it. We don't think of the role of pornography as being basically teaching young men and adult men how to treat women, and because this is the only thing that there is. And in most cases, women are not believed, women are not listened to. This case is extraordinary in part because Gisèle Pelicot, because of the choices she made, but also because she was hard to doubt as a victim because there were all these videos and photos. So she was able, she benefited from, trust and reliability, which is something that most victims don't have are not lucky enough to have. But we need to really, looking into the computers and the phones of the men who are accused should be standard in any case of rape, for example. There's so many more things that we need to do that just it's not happening.
Cécile Simmons, Australia's recently been rocked by a teenage suicide, a case of revenge porn leading to a young man taking his life. And that has prompted the drafting of a bill to restrict social media for young people. Is that the way to go?
Well, I think a lot of countries are looking to that measure actually with quite a lot of hope. I think there is an understanding that I think social media can have a really harmful effect on young people. I think going back to the point that was made about pornography, researchers have found that the pornography that young people can access online really has strong overlaps with extreme kind of misogynistic communities in the way they speak about women. We know that social media is, associated with a range of harms. So for sure, I think there is, a growing, movement towards stronger regulation and sort of restrictions in access, for sure. I think there are also signs from other countries as well. I think in the US there was a case where a 10-year-old self-asphyxiated after watching a TikTok video, and following that, there was, judges established kind of liability for the platform. So I think we're seeing that movement, which I think is important, and certainly a discussion about, I think, social media bans is an important one, but then there is also obviously the bigger social conversation that needs to happen that I was mentioning earlier.
Yeah, and Rachel Fleur-Pardo was mentioning earlier this issue of what to do about these date rape drugs. Our panel raising concerns over how whether women can be believed, and sort of meshing the two. On Monday, the French Prime Minister visiting a public hospital where he announced measures that include making it more available, testing for date rape drugs. Solange Mougin has that story.
This clinic is one of the few places, in addition to hospitals, where chemical submission testing kits are available.
This is a little kit that allows you to test your urine quickly. I'm thinking antidepressants, anti-anxiety and other medicine often found at home, and that's often used in chemical submission cases.
From sleeping pills to stimulants, this kit tests for 24 different drugs.
The test needs to be taken very quickly, with a maximum of 24 hours after a suspected chemical submission case.
Up till now, the test kits could only be ordered by a judge and cost €1,000. But the French government announced it will soon launch a pilot program in certain areas. They'll be available by prescription in select pharmacies, and they'll be reimbursed by the French healthcare system.
It will take less time than how the testing is done now.
My youngest is 24 years old, and I always tell her to be careful when she goes out. I tell her to keep her glass closed, to not let it out of her sight.
This pharmacist has never had a client ask for a chemical submission test, but that doesn't mean there isn't a need.
Today, there isn't really a demand for tests, but I think that's because people don't know about them, but also perhaps because they don't know where to go to get them. But with better communications and information, I hope it will get people talking and acting on this.
In light of the Gisèle Pelicot rape case, awareness of this risk, particularly for women, is growing. Already prior to that chemical submission trial, some 2,000 calls and complaints were registered by Paris's hospitals in 2022. That's up from 71 the year prior. Figures that are thought to be just a small portion of the real number of chemical submission cases.
Okay, so more people calling in suspected cases. Rachel Fleur-Pardo, let's say these test kits are available elsewhere. Let's say somebody does go in for them. Let's say they do test positive. Then what? How does it work?
I think then if you test positive, you will go maybe to to the police and maybe file a complaint, and then maybe there will be an investigation that will allow you to figure out who drugged you, what happened, and maybe it will help. So maybe it's a start somewhere. But we were speaking earlier about sexual education. I think that for too long we have made of sexuality a taboo that we will not speak of we will not speak about within our families, we will not speak about at school, and we have made it something to be ashamed of. And so that any kids that could have had questions about sexuality was not able to ask anything to all the adults around him. But now I think it is time for the education system in France to take its part in sexual education, in affective education as well. And it is really important that the program that has been worked on for the past month, that is supposed to be adapted to the different ages that we have, from the younger days at school to the end of high school, to have the appropriate teaching about sexuality. And I think it's very important because when we see how sexism is still very present and even stronger maybe within the younger generations today compared to older generation, we have to ask ourselves, why? What is the difference between this younger generation and the older generation? It has something to do with the internet. It has something to do with social media. It has something to do with access to pornography. It is the first generation that has such a wide access to pornography and internet and social media at such a young age. And this has consequences on how they see consent, on how they see sexuality, and on how they see relationship and equality between men and women.
On this point, Alexandra Lachowski, what are you finding at your association?
On this point, I mean, what we're seeing is that today there's an absolute, as was mentioned before, there's an absolute lack of education, or even within our institutions.
Because listening to Rachel there, it sounds like the parents are not doing their job.
I think that one thing that she mentioned that is very true is that there is such a taboo today that it's very hard even for a child to go to his parents or to his school teachers or to anyone for that kind of advice. I think that it's also very hard for a parent to know exactly how to talk about those topics, and parents are not specifically helped either.
Yeah,
it's very hard for them to know how to deal with that situation, or to know where to go when they want to know how to deal with that situation.
Yeah, so I think the state has to help everyone bring the conversation with kids and teenagers at the right time, in the right way.
Cécile Simmons, is it the same where you are?
Well, I think that absolutely. I think the conversation about, if we mentioned pornography, I think it's one that falls on society, it's one that falls on parents, it's one that falls on teachers. I don't think there is one single, person responsible for having those difficult conversations. I think another conversation that also needs to happen is actually platforms' responsibility. And if we talk about pornography, quite often online pornography is an area that has evolved almost outside of any regulation, because it's believed to be, an area of sexual expression in which the state shouldn't have any say. Whereas actually what pornography platforms are, they're like social media platforms. They rely on algorithms to curate content for users. And we know what algorithms do. They recommend you, once you start clicking on something, it recommends you more of the same and more extreme versions of it to keep you hooked. And the studies on online pornography have really shown that they really show things that wouldn't be allowed to be portrayed elsewhere, women being spat on, just women being treated like animals, and we wouldn't tolerate that for anything else. So I think there's also a regulation question when it comes to pornography. But when it comes to the social discussion, I think that really is a kind of, multi-sector conversation that needs to happen. And it's indeed one that is difficult for parents alone to have.
Elsa Labouret, is there a French specificity when it comes to this, or is it the same problem the world over?
To pornography or education or
the education of raising awareness, because raising awareness is not just about pornography, but about the attitudes you're supposed to have towards.
I think it's a problem everywhere,
beings.
but I think the French are particularly, we're pudique. I don't even know how to translate it, but we're sort
Prudish.
of like. Yeah, kind of, but more in a we don't talk about certain things, Oh, we'd like some more dessert, and we just don't, discuss certain things. It's just not proper. And I think we're still on these attitudes for a lot of
Why
things.
is that?
It's hard to say. I think, I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly where it comes from, but I think it's just, we like to think that these topics are not proper. And that's part of the shame. We talk about shame a lot in this trial because, Gisèle Pelicot has done so much to show that she's not going to bear the shame of what happened to her. She's not supposed to. It's just someone that something happened to, but the shame is going to be borne by the men who did this to her. Our organization actually did something years ago, a campaign that says shame must change sides. This is something that, shame plays such a role in silencing victims. so that it becomes a topic, not only because it's sexuality, which is already a delicate topic, but also being the victim of, a sexual violence is still very taboo, is still very shameful, even though, yes, victims are not supposed to carry that shame, but that is changing very slowly. But another thing I just want to add is just, this education conversation is very important, but also the thing that we really need to end is impunity. We need to stop, men are also raping because they know they can get away with it, because less than 1% of rapes lead to sentencing, conviction, thank you. There's a lot more of charges being pressed, but now today, 94% of charges in regard to rape are classés sans suite, which basically means that there's little to no inquiry and just is not going to go to trial. Nothing's going to happen with that.
And is that because the courts are swamped, or it's that because
maybe,
there's too high a bar for conviction?
I think it's just, I'm going to let you finish, but just if the justice system were to try every rape case that happens in France, it would be completely overwhelmed. We need to rethink the way that we see it. There's this push to change the law, and particularly with the question of consent, but that's not necessarily where the main problem is. The problem is in the interpretation of the law and what actually happens in courtrooms, and it's just not enough.
So there's not a need for new laws, because I know the Justice Minister is thinking about a new bill to introduce explicitly the notion of consent in French law.
A new law will not have the effect of a magic wand. It will not, by itself, make impunity decrease. What I want to say about impunity in rape cases, I think it has also a lot to do with evidence. And evidence, with time, they disappear little by little. So it is very important that everything is done to help victims speak up, and speak up as soon as they can. And shame has a lot to do with silencing victims. And this is why I think this Pelicot case, thanks to Gisèle Pelicot, is so important. And this is why I think there could be a Gisèle Pelicot effect, because she's showing victims that they have nothing to be ashamed of. And by showing that, she's helping victims speaking up.
Not everybody's up to that, though. It's pretty amazing that this woman can put herself in front of the cameras every day. Not everyone's built of that metal.
It's an incredibly brave thing that she did when she decided to waive her right to anonymity. And I think that, as Rachel said, there's a big thank you to be given to this very brave woman. And as they both said, shame equals silence, silence equals impunity, and impunity means no accountability, be it individual or collective. So I do agree that just changing the definition of rape is not going to solve all our problems. It's not going to save women and children, and it's not going to protect and support our survivors. However, I do think that the fact that 35 defendants decided to plead not guilty, that they decided to challenge the qualification of their crimes, that Gisèle Pelicot had to endure victim-blaming tactics, that she had to hear the abhorrent claim that her husband's permission could have implied her consent. I think that highlights the urgent need for some change in the law, and obviously for some change in the way that we address sexual violence culturally. And I think it does start with a change of the definition of rape, basing it on consent. But the question, actually, basically, if we do that, that's what is expected of France since it signed the Istanbul Convention in 2014. That's what is expected of France, to have a consent-based definition. What we do have to make sure, and what we do have to look out for, is the way that the legislators are going to actually draft that law and implement it. And I make a case that we have to look at what our European counterparts are doing. For instance, in Belgium, the law it's been based on consent since the 80s. It's been modified in 2022 to adapt to our realities today.
The digital age.
Exactly. In Belgium, Gisèle Pelicot would not have had to face the inhuman defense strategies that she faced in Belgium, because the law is unambiguous. There is no consent when a victim is unconscious. There is no consent when a victim is asleep.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, so I'm going to have to leave it there. But so much more to talk about on this topic. I want to thank you, Alexandra Lachowski. I want to thank as well Rachel Flore Pardo, Elsa Labouré. I want to thank Cécile Simmons for being with us from London. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.